If you lived in the medieval Mediterranean 1,000 years ago, you might never have held a gold coin, tasted imported cinnamon, or seen a silk merchant unload his shimmering bundles at the docks. But you would have known the taste, smell, and weight of dried figs. They were part of your year, your table, your work, your travels, and very likely your moments of hunger and relief. In times when people feared famine the way modern people fear storms, dried figs were one of the few foods that could be trusted to endure. They were quiet, humble, wrinkled pieces of fruit, but they shaped survival more than many glamorous goods ever did. To understand why dried figs mattered so deeply, you must picture the Mediterranean not as a map, but as an enormous sun-struck bowl of coasts and mountains, where communities lived at the mercy of weather, sea currents, unpredictable harvests, and the rugged geography that separated village from village. Across this landscape, people leaned heavily on foods that were dependable. Some relied on wheat and barley, though both could fail in a single season of drought. Others raised olives for oil, though storms could strip trees of their fruit. But figs, particularly dried figs, were the golden thread running quietly through the economies and kitchens of countless households. Imagine the late summer sun hanging a pale blue sky above a hillside near Corinth, or Palermo, or Almeria. The heat is the kind that dries laundry in minutes and cracks clay pots left too long in the shade. Under that sky, fig trees, sturdy, twisting, generous things, stand with their leaves trembling in a faint sea breeze. Their branches bend under the weight of soft, plump figs, which have ripened almost overnight. Children climb the low branches and drop the figs into baskets. Women gather the fallen ones. Farmers wipe sweat from their foreheads and check the fruit for signs of overripeness. By midday, the entire village smells faintly sweet, like honey warmed on a firestone. These figs cannot wait. Fresh figs spoil quickly within hours, sometimes especially in Mediterranean heat. So immediately after picking, families begin preparing them for drying. This, too, is an art passed down through generations. Some figs are split neatly in half and opened outward like tiny flowers. Others are left whole but pricked to release moisture. They are laid on woven reed mats, spread on rooftops, courtyard stones, or wooden frames propped above the earth. And then, for days, the sun does its work. Bees hover. Dogs circle the edges but know they are not allowed near the precious harvest. Children chase each other between the rows of drying fruit while elderly grandparents supervise, calling out reminders to turn the figs gently to ensure they dry evenly. The transformation is slow but certain. A ripe fig full of water soon collapses into a soft, leathery shape. The sugars concentrate. The flavor deepens. Once dry, they are pressed into tight bundles or small brick-like shapes. Sometimes they are dusted with flour to prevent sticking, or packed layer upon layer in clay jars and sealed with wax. Families treat these jars with a reverence usually reserved for money or tools, because in many ways, dried figs were both. A jar of dried figs in the medieval Mediterranean was a kind of insurance. Modern people might rely on savings accounts or supermarkets. Medieval families relied on cellars filled with dried goods that would outlast winter. If a harvest failed or trade routes were disrupted by storms, raiders, or political tensions, dried figs kept people alive. They were never considered a luxury, though in Northern Europe they often became one, but rather a reliable, nourishing staple. You could stretch a stew with chopped figs. You could feed a laborer with a handful of them. You could walk for miles on a diet of figs, water, and a bit of hard bread. People in the medieval world may not have known the precise nutritional science behind figs, but they understood their effects. Physicians across the Mediterranean, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars alike praised figs for their digestive benefits, energy, and versatility. Monasteries grew orchards of their own, and monks ate figs during fasting periods because the fruit offered sweetness without violating dietary restrictions. Midwives used fig poultices in certain remedies, and shepherds relied on figs when grazing lands were barren. Even sailors preparing for uncertain voyages carried dried figs because, unlike meat or butter or vegetables, they would not spoil at sea. The fig tree itself held symbolic and spiritual meaning in many of the cultures surrounding the Mediterranean. In Islamic tradition, figs are mentioned in the Quran as one of the sacred fruits. In Christian writings, the fig tree appears repeatedly, often symbolizing stability, patience, or divine provision. But symbolism and reverence alone did not give the fruit its far-reaching value. The real engine behind its importance was the web of trade routes that tied empires, islands, ports, and small villages together. To travel across the Mediterranean in the Middle Ages was to pass through a world stitched together by merchant ships, dusty caravans, mountain paths, and coastal markets. And dried figs were among the most frequently exchanged goods. Not because they were rare, but because they were wanted everywhere. Picture a small ship leaving the island of Crete. Its deck is stacked with amphorae sealed with wax, packed with figs harvested from inland orchards. The sailors know that many things may happen at sea: sudden storms, pirates, shifting winds, or breakdowns. But they also know the figs will survive the journey. When the ship reaches a trading port like Constantinople, Alexandria, or Venice, merchants examine the shipments with practiced hands. The fig bundles may be exchanged for textiles, metal tools, spices, ceramics, or grain. Some are purchased in bulk and transported further north, where figs cannot grow and where dried Mediterranean fruit is prized in noble households or monasteries. There, the same figs that fed farmers in Sicily might now appear on the feast table of a wealthy merchant in Paris or London. A rare and exotic sweetness in a land of apples and oats. Northern Europeans, unfamiliar with fig trees and their generous nature, often perceived dried figs as curious delicacies. They arrived in wooden crates or barrels lined with straw. Some wealthy households displayed figs at winter banquets, pairing them with cheese, nuts, or honey. Others used them in baking or to flavor ale. Even in the coldest months, when frost sealed the land and harvests were long gone, dried figs offered a taste of southern sun. But even as figs traveled far, their most essential role remained close to home. In a small village in the Emirate of Granada, a farmer's wife might portion out dried figs to her children on winter mornings, their small hands warming the soft fruit before eating. In a merchant's home in Genoa, dried figs might be the quick meal eaten before a journey. On a pilgrim road in the Levant, travelers heading toward Jerusalem might find that figs were the only food local villagers could spare. Figs became a quiet shared language across the Mediterranean. You could walk into a market in Tunis or Thessaloniki and see the same bundles, wide flattened discs strung on cords, small cube-shaped blocks tied with twine, round fig cakes pressed with nuts or sesame seeds. The merchants selling them spoke different languages, but the product was unmistakable. Even in times of political upheaval, such as during the Crusades, the Norman conquest of southern Italy, or the rise and fall of Andalusian kingdoms, figs flowed through markets more reliably than most other goods. The durability of dried figs, however, does not fully explain their success. It was also the simplicity of producing them. Unlike olive oil, which required presses and skilled labor, or wine, which demanded careful fermentation, drying figs required little more than sun, cloth, and time. This created a rare form of economic independence. Poor families, smallholders, widows, or tenant farmers could produce a product that merchants were willing to buy. In certain regions, dried figs even served as a form of tax payment. In villages along the Dalmatian coast or the islands of the Aegean, landlords sometimes accepted figs as part of a tenant's rent. Soldiers in some Mediterranean armies were occasionally paid in dried fruit when coinage was short. The fig became, in a way, a currency of necessity. Its value lay not in prestige but in practicality. And in a world where survival was often uncertain, practicality was priceless. Some of the oldest medieval travelers' journals mention dried figs with surprising fondness. One Italian pilgrim wrote of receiving a handful of the sweetest dried figs from a Syrian farmer who had little else to offer. A monk from Burgundy described eating figs daily while traveling through the Holy Land because they were the only thing gentle on the stomach. A sailor from Majorca wrote in a letter that dried figs had kept an entire crew fed during a week-long storm that prevented cooking aboard the ship, even in their most mundane forms. Figs created small bridges of kindness and connection. A fisherman might share a few with a shepherd on a dusty road. A grandmother might tuck some into a cloth pouch for her grandchildren. A merchant might pay a porter with a handful of figs instead of coin. These moments seem small, but in the slow rhythm of medieval life, they shaped relationships, comfort, and resilience. Then there was the matter of taste. Medieval cuisine, especially among the poor, was simple. Bread, porridge, occasional vegetables, and rarely meat. Sweets were not everyday items. Sugar, when available, was extremely expensive. Honey was precious. For most people, dried figs were the closest thing to dessert. Their sweetness, concentrated by the sun, made them beloved by children and adults alike. That sweetness also allowed them to be used in cooking to thicken sauces, sweeten stews, or balance the sharpness of cheese and vinegar. In wealthier homes, cooks used dried figs in elaborate dishes, stuffing them with nuts or spices. In poorer homes, mothers would stew dried figs to soften them, making a warm treat in winter. They were one of the few foods that could feel like a luxury, even when life was harsh. Across centuries and empires, dried figs remained unchanged. Simple, nourishing, adaptable, and nearly indestructible. They witnessed the rise of Islamic caliphates, the shifting power of Byzantine emperors, the arrival of crusaders, the flourishing of Italian city-states, and the quiet endurance of countless villages perched on hillsides or tucked along coasts. Through all of this, the fig harvest continued, predictable in a world where so little else was. By the late Middle Ages, dried figs had fully cemented themselves as a Mediterranean essential. Port cities like Barcelona, Marseille, Alexandria, and Tripoli saw steady streams of fig shipments. Farmers along the coasts of Anatolia and the Levant often planted fig trees because they knew their fruit would always find a buyer. On the island of Cyprus, fig exports became a small but reliable segment of the local economy. In Sardinia, villagers celebrated the fig harvest with informal gatherings that mixed work with festivities. Across Greece, Italy, and North Africa, generations grew up with the yearly ritual of drying figs as naturally as modern people expect the turning of seasons. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the medieval dried fig is how little it asked of the world. It needed no processing plants, no freezing, no machinery, no spices, no learned skill beyond patience and attentiveness. The fig was generous, a fruit that tolerated rocky soil, strong winds, and drought. A fruit that offered 2 harvests in many regions. A fruit that fed humans, animals, travelers, workers, monks, nobles, merchants, and shepherds alike in the end. What made dried figs so valuable across the medieval Mediterranean was not glamour, rarity, or symbolism. It was dependability. The fig tree could be trusted to bear fruit. The sun could be trusted to dry it. The dried fruit could be trusted to last. In a world woven tightly with uncertainty of weather, war, trade, and health, figs offered continuity. They offered calories when there were none, sweetness when sweetness was scarce, and nourishment that traveled well across land and sea. And so, if you imagine a medieval home's stone walls, a wooden door, a small hearth, a dark storage room, you can picture a jar of dried figs resting quietly on a shelf. It might be opened slowly in winter, each piece a measure of survival. It might be shared with guests. It might be a child's favorite treat. It might be a merchant's emergency ration. It might simply be the most dependable food in a life where dependability was precious. Thus the dried fig, humble and unremarkable in appearance, became one of the Mediterranean's most essential treasures. Not because it dazzled the senses or brought wealth like silver or silk, but because it sustained the rhythm of everyday life. It fed the hungry, supported the traveler, strengthened the worker, and followed the pathways of trade from one shore to another. It connected empires, nourished villages, and shaped centuries quietly, one sun-dried piece at a time. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me tonight, and for letting these soft, sleepy stories keep you company. If you enjoyed this calm journey through history and it helped you rest a little easier, I'd truly appreciate it if you gave the video a like. And if you'd like more slow, peaceful stories every night, feel free to subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. Your support helps keep this calm little corner of the internet alive. Wishing you a restful night and the sweetest, most peaceful sleep. Good night.